You can probably hear I'm not as Canadian as perhaps some other people, but I'm half Canadian. Thank you. When I put in to take a session, I started off with something that was terribly intellectual and all the rest of it. And when I was preparing it, I thought, actually, let's try and stay better grounded. So I will be doing some of the more intellectual bits at the end with any luck, but I wanted to also present what's happening in Europe and do a little bit of a compare and contrast with Canada. And I wanted to inform you and tease you in order to spark some debate. So I shall be marginally more extreme in my presentation than I am in my views, but only marginally. And I would like to, with any luck, encourage a movement towards more shared frameworks and things in Canada. So that's the sort of subtext. And I can see we've got even more trouble entering the room now. The things I want to talk about, first of all, the usual vexed question of learning outcomes and competencies, and then I want to tell you a bit about what's happening in Europe, a little bit about one of the projects that we're working with, which I think has been producing some interesting things, and then one of my hobby horses is competency, so you weren't going to escape without that, and a little bit about work-based learning from competency profiles, and then a comparison of Canada and Europe. So first of all, definitions. That's always a good academic way to begin, isn't it? Define your terms. And I put down a couple of definitions, one for learning outcomes and one for competencies. And could I say that for me, the word competence, which is what I tend to use at home, and competency, which is what I tend to use when I'm in Canada, but I often get confused between the two, have no distinction in meaning. I use them interchangeably. And so please don't get all difficult with me if you think I should be using the one or the other, because I think they're both used in so many different ways that it's simpler to regard them as entirely interchangeable. So competency it is. Learning outcomes. Does everybody know about learning outcomes? Is it something everybody's happy and familiar with? Is that a yes? Good. Okay. Competency, I think people probably are also happy with, and the only reason I put it in is to make sure that people are clear that although competencies can be learning outcomes, it is quite possible to have learning outcomes which are not competencies. And this is, again, a hobby horse, but I really do believe that there's a lot of confusion with people assuming that learning outcomes are entirely interchangeable with competencies, and I don't think that helps anybody because it creates confusion. And then another bit of divided by a common language. I tend to use the word qualifications, and credential is a more appropriate word in Canada, and I will try and get it right, but I put them both there just in case. The definition of qualification, or of credential, is almost entirely taken from the European qualification framework, but it seems to me to be a nice, simple, practical definition. A formal outcome of an assessment and validation process, which is obtained when a competent body determines that an individual has achieved learning outcomes to given standards. And unlike many academic definitions, that seems to me to be a nice, straightforward one. Qualifications frameworks, again, that's something that's there's a lot of it about at the moment, and when I first heard about qualifications frameworks, I thought it was something terribly complicated and clever. But in fact, it's a set of levels and the levels are the intellectual challenge of being able to do whatever it is that that credential relates to, or even if it's less than a credential, what that competency or learning outcome relates to. And so it's just a set of levels and level descriptors that determine which level is appropriate. And you can then use them in all sorts of clever ways, but that's what it's about, basically. Okay, the European context. I haven't put down collapse of euro, infighting between Germans and Greeks, because I think and I hope that that's a transitory phase. Within Europe, I think we have within the European Union, I think we have 28 countries at the moment. There's new applications being developed. However, it's not just the European Union we're talking about, because there are 31 countries involved with the European qualification framework in Europe, and there's 48 countries involved with the European higher education. So the point I'm trying to make is that it's not just the European Union, this is bigger than both of us. And within the European Union, and even more within the rest, one has a very rich number of languages. Just for example, we have 3 different alphabets in the European Union that we're using. We've got Greek, Cyrillic, and lots of variations on Roman. 300 million people, a wonderful history of rival and conflicts. And I'm pointing that out to draw contrasts with Canada, which has very great diversity, has also a fine history of rivalry and conflict, but in terms of millions who've died, we're winning in spades. And so all I'm saying is what we have managed to achieve in Europe is in spite of all of this, and to some extent because of all of this. But I'm not suggesting that you have a mighty war in order to spur things forward. The way that the European Union works, and of course beyond the European Union it has to work as well, is one where all the countries have their own autonomy, that the countries voluntarily commit to join particular things, and they develop common frameworks, they jointly agree targets that they will all work to, they then jointly normally don't manage to quite reach the targets on time, but do actually manage to reach them in a year or 2 later. And they work a lot with benchmarking, collecting data, seeing how each other are doing, seeing if there are good ideas that are being done by others that can be taken and used within your own country. The European higher education area has been around. That's the one that has 48 countries now, and it grows out of something that was called the Bologna process, and it's got a whole lot of different things, but the most important ones are that all of the countries within it, their university degrees now are 3 cycles. The first cycle is for undergraduate degrees, bachelor degrees, second for master's degrees, and third for doctorates. And all countries, all the 48 countries have now moved to that, and for most of them that is a move, and for most of them, most of the universities involved, it's a move that overturns centuries, in some case a millennium of tradition. So it's the fact that it's happened very quickly, voluntarily, without any tanks, is a mighty achievement, I think. I've got a great long list, which I'll share with you if you ask for it at the end, about what the European Higher Education Authority area actually contains. But for the most part, it's the standard framework, and then also quality assurance and encouraging people so that it's a single market for higher education. You can do 1 degree in one country, then move to another country and it all fits so that you can do the next degree there, and it will all be recognised, and it'll work. The European Qualifications Framework has started off just by declaring these 8 levels of the eight reference levels, and everybody first of all they say that they will develop their own national qualification framework, and where you have nice divided countries like England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, or French Belgium and Flemish Belgium, then they have different qualification frameworks in each part, but they're all related to the European Qualifications Framework. And now we are getting real progress with countries developing qualifications frameworks and relating theirs to the to the EQF. Learning outcomes are specified in both the EHEA and the EQF as the basis for comparison. So learning outcomes are absolutely fundamental to the whole thinking that's going on in Europe, and that means that one's moving from an input-based system to an outcome-based system, and that really is almost the only show in town now in Europe. We've been, under the UNILO project, which I'll be telling you about, I was doing a case study of what they do at Cambridge University, which is one of the older, more prestigious, and therefore likely to be less likely to change with new fads university. And they had changed to learning outcomes so totally and so long ago that they no longer had anybody who could remember how you did things differently and how they'd made the change, which rather took me by surprise. I was expecting to find that we don't do things like that here. Recognition of prior learning and lifelong learning have also been built into these frameworks very explicitly. They're things that are measured, and countries have to report on how they're doing. When I say have to, they have committed themselves to report on how they're doing, and they then can compare and see what changes are happening. And recognition of prior learning is in that. The competency-based approach is also something which is very rapidly moving across Europe as part of the whole movement to learning outcomes and outcome-based and student-centered approach. And attached to the competency-based approach are occupational standards, and we have also developed a European framework for key competencies, which is equivalent to essential skills, as far as I can see, in Canada. And then there's another alphabet soup of ECTS, is European Credit Transfer System, which is for university degrees. ECVET, which is European Credit Transfer for Vocational Education and Training. Europass is a set of useful things, one of which is a standard CV format, another of which is the diploma supplement, so that all university degrees in the whole of the 48 countries, they give a diploma supplement in a major European language in addition to giving their degree certificate. And the diploma supplement is in standard form, and therefore the chances of somebody else being able to understand it in another country are much greater. Standard form, one of the major languages, you're in with quite a good chance. Like all things, reality comes in many flavors. One has many things that have been agreed, and yet when you go and talk to people, you find that actually, even though it's law, it's all been agreed, it's not actually happening quite like that. And I have to confess, that we in Europe are no different in that respect. That if you talk to the universities on the ground and if you talk to the students on the ground, you may find that their knowledge of some of these things is not as great as you might expect. But it's happening, it's coming. I've mentioned that the European higher education area has introduced cycles, the 3 cycles. All universities are now expressing their degrees in terms of learning outcomes. They've also developed under the tuning projects, and tuning is to mean fine-tuning. The tuning projects have developed standard degree profiles for common degree subjects. So things like history, mathematics, engineering. There are standard sets of learning outcomes that all countries within, all universities within the EHEA, they will include those learning outcomes so that if somebody comes to you with a degree in that subject area, you can rest assured that at least that core area has been covered. There may well be special bits and lots of other bits, but it means you've got a much better idea of what's going on. European qualification framework, they reckon that by the end of this year, and that's not very far away, there will be 18 countries who have not only developed a national qualification framework, but have also referenced it to the European qualification framework. That's quite a big increase since last year, when it was about 4 or 5. With that standard CV, there's 7,000 CVs being created every day using the Europass CV format. All the universities in Europe, even though they are autonomous and governments aren't allowed to tell them what to do, though they can of course decide not to pay them, they have agreed collectively that they accept the European higher education area and its formats and so on, and that they're all going to work towards them. And as I say, for the most part, all degrees now across Europe are in that format. This is about the European qualifications framework, and it's worldwide. The yellow countries are planning, developing and implementing. Now, I borrowed this diagram, as you'd expect, and I was interested to see that Canada was yellow, because I wasn't too much aware that it was even planning, let alone developing or implementing. I believe that there are 137 countries worldwide which are at the moment planning, developing or implementing. I hope that Canada isn't typical of those 137, because that implies that the data is badly out. I don't think it is. The orange countries are the European qualification framework ones. The grey ones are not yet developing anything. And then there are those cloud areas where there's the Bologna, European higher education area is the pink cloud, the red cloud is South Africa. I can't remember what SADC stands for, Development Community. And ASEAN is the purple one, and the light blue is the Caribbean. And then the little blue blobs, which is the framework of the Commonwealth. Transnational Qualifications Framework of the Commonwealth. So you can see that it's happening in a lot of places, and what has been most interesting has been the way that the development of a national qualification framework has actually been a spur to have a look at how well one's qualifications are working, how well they join with each other, how well they match the labour market, how well they assessment relates to the teaching, etc., and it's leading to a lot of reform. CamProf is a partner in a European funded project which is working with universities to try to promote learning outcomes. Now, the fact that you have a project promoting learning outcomes in universities proves the point of what I was saying earlier, that although everything's been agreed, in fact, on the ground, it's not quite as rosy as one might like to think. There's still a lot of work to be done to help many European countries in developing their learning outcomes, in getting the most out of their learning outcomes. And we did a questionnaire survey, which wasn't as big a survey as I would have hoped in most countries, but what we found was that there was massive ignorance of learning outcomes, what they were, how they might be useful to a student, amongst the students, and a disturbing amount of ignorance even amongst the university staff, except in UK and Ireland, where they've been using them for many years and people don't understand what the fuss is about. And in the UK and Ireland, all courses are now in terms of learning outcomes, as are, to all intents and purposes, all professional institution qualifications, and all assessment is carried out based on learning outcomes.
You said in the UK and Ireland, so is it totally throughout the UK? They're all learning outcomes based for that?
All the university degrees at bachelor and master degree level are throughout the UK. I think you'd be very hard pressed to find one that wasn't. I know, there may be something lurking in Lampeter that I don't know about, but yes. Yes.
Does this imply this growing standardization? Does this imply we have?
No, it doesn't imply growing standardization. Each of them has, it implies a standardization of approach and method, but not all using identical learning outcomes at all.
Oh, thank you.
Having said that, within the UK, for virtually every degree title, we now have a set of, I'm trying to remember what they call it, profiles, I think, which are the definition of, again, like the tuning project, but specific to UK, the core thing, learning outcomes that must be within that subject area. And so all mathematics degrees will have a certain core which that degree must have, but they'll have lots of other things that aren't within the core as well. And that covers virtually all bachelor and master's degrees in UK now. There's a few odd ones, but...
And again, is that sort of coordinating all the ones from the different countries in the UK? Didn't they use, like Scotland had their own subject benchmarks, etc. before? Is it bringing them together?
It's brought them all together. I'm not aware of there being different Scottish subject benchmarks from English subject benchmarks.
Well, I'm not sure, like, I thought they did before, and I thought this was just a new coordinated effort.
What I suspect has happened is that the Scots started it off, and then the English decided, yes, that's quite a good idea, and now it's known as English. But I might be wrong. The project, the UNILO project, is intending to produce a series of tools for European universities to help them to make better use of learning outcomes. For example, to help students and persuade students to look at the learning outcomes in order to choose their courses, their programs, and then in order to decide how they prepare to be assessed on them and everything like that, and also to use them for their writing their CVs afterwards and things like that. A little bit about competency. My belief is that competency should include not only knowledge and skills, but also attitudes and values. And so when one is preparing standards of competency, or competency profiles, whatever, then I would expect to see attitudes and values in there. Learning outcomes very often don't include attitudes and values. Sometimes they don't include all that much in terms of skills. They're much more concentrated very often at the knowledge end, but that's not always true. But the point which I made slightly earlier is that learning outcomes include competencies. Competencies must be possible as a learning outcome, but there are learning outcomes which may not include all the parts that are needed for competency. And why has competency become so widespread and so attractive? Why has it been adopted so widely? And it's learner-centered, which is found to be very beneficial. It tends to help towards employability. And there's a downside of that, which is that competencies sometimes are too narrowly defined so that they don't cover the spread. Competencies tend to be nice and explicit about health and safety issues, and so they can be very helpful. If it's competency working towards the workplace, then health and safety clearly needs to be very explicit in there, and so they're very helpful from that point of view. They help mobility. Because competencies are modular, then if you are competent in a particular occupational area, I'm a civil engineer. If I want to become an architect because I suddenly decide that I'm not getting enough artistic expression into my life, then the competencies that I require to add in order to become an architect are relatively few. Out of the 15 main competencies for a civil engineer, probably only about 4 of them, 3 of them are significantly different for the two professions. And in fact, out of those 15, probably 4 or 5 of them would be common to virtually any other profession. And so by having competency-based standards, then it is much easier for people to have career changes where they move to a related or even a rather less related occupation. And with the days of lifelong learning and the days of no longer jobs for life, this is rather important. And I suspect, as usual, that if I ask people around the room how many of you are doing the job that your degree fitted you for immediately, probably not many hands would go up, because we're all doing different things from what we originally got our credentials in. Not only that, but the credentials we got probably no longer would be relevant even in that subject. Certainly as a civil engineer, I'm sure that's true. So they help with sectoral mobility, and also, I don't need to tell Canadians, they help with geographical mobility. They have also been found to help articulating higher education with vocational education and training, and they have a lot of actual applications of uses. You can use the specifications that are competency for a lot of practical things. My next slide will be about that. But in order to get the best out of them, what we've found in Europe is that you do need to coordinate. You have to share across sectors and across jurisdictions, because otherwise you get not only duplication of effort, people reinventing wheels, but the wheels that they reinvent tend to be a different shape, and they don't fit easily on each other's vehicles. So that if you have one sector, let us say retail trade, and you have another sector which is construction, when the construction boom goes down, there may well be civil engineers out looking for a job who think that they actually would be able to use their management skills to manage something in the retail sector, or they retire and decide they'd like to open a shop, or whatever it happens to be. But the point is that if you've defined all the management skills in the retail sector completely independently from the way you've defined them in the construction sector, then those credentials don't match. And so it very much helps to have coordination at a national level, across sectors and across jurisdictions. And that coordination can provide standard formats so that people prepare things so that they look the same form. They can provide the definitions of transferable skills. Now, I've used the word transferable skill because there's a lot of skills or competencies which are not the essential skills, but they're still transferable. Like I was talking about management, when you are procuring things for a company, you do that in a whole lot of different sectors. When you're marketing, you do that in a whole lot of different sectors. Of course, the context makes a difference, but it doesn't make a fundamental difference for the most part. And the national coordination also helps with sharing best practice, sharing experience, and sharing limited resources. And limited resources, of course, are becoming more limited month by month, as far as I can detect. Bad news for consultants. Uses of competencies. We've got a list, which I can dig out here, of 88 things you can do with competency, and examples of that are occupational standards. You can use them for training and development. You can use them for performance appraisals, career management, for defining what an occupation is, and then having a look at career progression and how people progress from one occupation to the next one. Regulation, and I'm sure that the regulatory bodies who are represented would agree that they're very useful for regulation to specify actually what somebody needs to be competent at. And quality assurance of human inputs. When, as a civil engineer, when we're specifying workmanship, we can use the standards. And in fact, we don't need to use the credentials necessarily. We can say that plastering needs to be done to the standard as set out in the occupational standard. And the same with the project manager and the site agent and all the other roles that you have on a building site. And therefore you can also put them into contracts, procurement contracts for procuring new construction works. So the point I'm making is that there's a lot of things you can do with them. They're useful things well beyond just credentials. This is just me trying to get my mind in order. I think with a competency profile, you're able to then assess against it, and that happens both as regulatory bodies or as universities and colleges. And that's the way we do things now in Europe and in UK. And from the assessment you have the credentials, and as anybody who came to the older worker meeting yesterday, from the credentials, self-esteem, professional recognition tend to be very useful benefits coming from it. And the competency profile can both lead to structured learning, and also structured learning can be designed to enhance and fit in with the competency profile. And one of the discussions we had over dinner last night was that you can have the knowledge delivered by one particular part of structured learning, while perhaps the practical experience is coming from work experience and on-the-job experience. And of course you have informal learning, experiential learning. And I'm expecting you all to memorize the boxes there, because the next one is a compare and contrast, and I haven't got them on the same slide. So now that you've memorized it, I'll move on. Work-based learning. again, starts with a competency profile, and people can self-assess against it, and also, with all those uses are expressed as tools, so that using the competency profile for writing a CV, that's an English word, isn't it? You can cope with that, thank you. And job adverts, and all sorts of things that you can develop tools to take automatically as pieces of computer software from the competency profile in order to develop the output. And we are increasingly doing that, using it for writing job descriptions, using it for self-appraisal and performance appraisals. So from both using the competency profile, the same competency profile in tools for the workplace and for self-assessment, you tend to get informal learning coming from that. People identify what they didn't know, they learn, they change their behavior, and then you move on to the final part, which is what we were talking about before, which was formal assessment and credentials and improved self-esteem and professional regulation, etc. And so the point I wanted to make was that you have benefits of competency profiles both for the work-based and experiential, as well as for the more formal. And this was my very subjective slide. I think that in terms of diversity, complexity, history and conflicts, Europe probably has a more difficult record than Canada. And so that's the context within which the cooperation that has happened in Europe has happened. And I would suggest that in terms of essential skills, both groups have developed systems which are working or beginning to work and which are across the board. In terms of learning outcomes, we certainly haven't got all the way yet in Europe, but I think we're, as far as I can detect, substantially further along the path than you are in Canada. I don't get the impression that every college and every university and every professional regulatory body has defined its credentials in terms of learning outcomes, but I may be wrong. In terms of competency standards, it's beginning. There's been very good progress made by different sectors in Canada from what I've seen, but I think we've got some parts of Europe that have gone a long way in it, and UK is clearly one of those. You've got a lot of Europe that has hardly progressed at all, if at all. Poland, which is another country which I know, has developed some, but hasn't actually managed to get it off the drawing board over the course of about 10 years. It hasn't started flying yet. Sector frameworks. These are things which I know there's examples of sector frameworks in Canada. The tourism sector has a couple of sector frameworks, I think. And similarly in Europe, we're just beginning to get some sector frameworks, and we're beginning to get, with encouragement from the European Commission, sector skills councils being set up, which are European sector skills councils crossing national boundaries. And I think that's extremely interesting because, in a way, it's leapfrogging over all the national boundaries. There's certainly been a big move by the European Commission to promote mobility and international working within Europe. So that, for example, I think they expect now to have 20% of all school children spend some time working in another school, and that's not university, that's school. They also, all of the European funded projects, you have to have people, partners from at least 3 different countries, and there's extra points if they're really different. If you just had Denmark, Norway and Sweden working together, they wouldn't be terribly impressed.
I
Does anybody have any other points they'd like to make? If not, then I think it's probably time for class dismiss, isn't it? Thank you very much indeed.